If Little Nightmares 3 disappointed you, you should absolutely be playing Reanimal instead. I was one of the people who found Little Nightmares 3 to be a good bit lacking in several regards. Content, execution, generally lacking in the sauce that made the IP under Tarsiers' direction so compelling and memorable. In comparison, I believe Reanimal has a ton of that inherent spirit in spades, and yet takes all of it a step further, forming in the process an entirely new body of work, and one that I really hope to see expanded and iterated upon in similar fashion. To be clear right at the start, I do think that Reanimal as it stands is a tad lacking in content, however, similar to Little Nightmares 3. I'm not as upset by it in this case, because the content that is here is by and large very good, but I think that folk wondering whether this game is worth $40 or not should heavily consider the purchase, and paying $60 for the deluxe edition, including the upcoming DLC to start releasing late in the year, is another great question of worth that is yet to be determined. I would personally blame nobody for waiting for a sale on Reanimal to pick it up, because it only took me about 4 hours to beat the whole game in one setting. It was an additional 3.5 hour run afterwards that it took me to get the Platinum Trophy, but 4 to 8 hours for $40 is certainly a steep price, especially to many these days. That said, however, Reanimal's $40 retail price I think is a little bit more worth than Little Nightmares 3's is, if we're going to continue along that same comparative wavelength. The main reason for this is because what Reanimal does is so much more polished than Little Nightmares 3, and also so much more explorative. You know, it's more expansive and more of an evolution, not to mention more punchy and more engaging generally speaking. And also because its co-op options actually make sense, and if you're looking for a co-op game between the two of them, Reanimal is your choice. But let's back up for just a moment. Whatever made Little Nightmares 1 and 2 work seems to me to be some inherent magic to be found in Tarsiers' personal vision for that world and its lore, a commitment to a tone that was fresh and new at the time. Those games succeeded in large part because they weren't outright horrific, though they were still quite obviously horror. There are creepy and generally unexplained character and level design decisions that imply a lot of story with zero words, and that draws the player in. There's a smidge of body horror influence that gives the player just enough of the willies to be freaked out, or better yet, to freak themselves out on account of it, yet does not relegate itself to cheap scares or gruesome moments to sell itself. In fact, there's a degree to which the understatedness of those games' horror actively contributes to how creepy it ends up being. No small part of it is more implied than not, and that really works. It also allows for the games to be a good bit more approachable to relatively younger audiences and to those typically off-put or made queasy by other categories of the genre. In essence, Tarsier knew what they wanted to do with those first couple of games, and they succeeded in doing so, yielding a pretty large fan base in the process. Barring a randomly obtuse environmental puzzle or a tad bit of jank here or there, those games are special, and they have the following that they do for a reason. And the reason is also a massive part of why the third game, developed by Supermassive Games, is a relatively maligned. You know, despite being a perfectly fine game, it just doesn't hit the way the first two did, and for more on my take on that, I actually did make a whole video about it about a month and a half ago in mid-January. So the question with regard to Reanimal became one more about potential. Would it be more or less spiritual successor of those prior games, or would it be something more entirely its own? My personal favorite thing about Reanimal is that it perfectly straddles the line between familiarity and evolution. Little Nightmares can be felt all over the place here, and I will be mentioning those games a lot throughout this review, but it's never there in a distracting way. It's more a reminder that this studio understands what it built and the strengths of that, and in order to extend beyond the bounds of what came before, Tarsier successfully adapted that approach to create a game that is arguably just as memorable as the games that put them on the map in the first place. First, I want to start with a handful of my criticisms of Reanimal before we actually talk about the opposite. The reason for this being, I believe that the problems are actually fairly few and far between as a rule, and also because I think it's far easier to do it this way for the sake of, being a somewhat useful review somewhat shortly-ish after the game's release. Many of these things are just nitpicks at worst, to be honest. And be warned that various spoilers for Reanimal, and perhaps implicitly also for the Little Nightmares franchise, will be mentioned throughout this video, and certain bits of gameplay will also be included. So if you want to go in blind, I recommend the game, and recommend you do go in blind, but for the purposes of this review, I can't really talk about it as extensively as I determined to set out in this review without going into, actually showing stuff. So, that's how things go. But the first issue, and quite frankly, the most notably disappointing one, is one that this game actually shares with its Supermassive Games counterpart, and that is brevity. Brevity is nice and all. It's nice when a game doesn't pad out its runtime or anything for arbitrary reasons, but as I mentioned in the introduction of this video, the $40 asking price could certainly be perceived to be steep considering the content that is on offer. As somebody who tends to spend notably more time in most games than the average on How Long to Beat, for example, Reanimal only took me 4 hours in the first run, and it got significantly less replay out of me than, say, Little Nightmares 3 did, taking less than 8 hours and 2 playthroughs to fully complete, compared to 14 to 20 hours over a handful of playthroughs. Now, in fairness, I could have completed Little Nightmares 3 in at least 1 less playthrough, to be sure, maybe even 2 fewer playthroughs if I consolidated some of those things a little bit better, but between co-op trophies as well as character-specific trophies, and predominantly being a solo gamer myself, that one has filled arguably as much of my life as either of its predecessors did. Reanimal will hardly ever be able to compete with that, even when its DLC comes out. And since Little Nightmares 3 also has a DLC releasing this year that I will be covering, yeah, I think you see what I'm trying to get at with this paragraph, and that is, if you determine value for cost heavily or primarily by the amount of time you're spending with the product, Reanimal might be pushing it for you. I am glad that Tarsier didn't overdo or overuse any of their ideas in Reanimal, don't get me wrong, but I definitely felt like there were some parts of the game that didn't have as much breathing time as they could have, most particularly the end chapters of the acts that kind of bridge the various acts together. But that makes for a wonderful case for my next point. Antagonistic and creature usage in Reanimal is a bit on the lower end compared to what I would have preferred. In some cases, certainly bordering on underutilization just straight up. The Sniffer is used to great effect in the first act of the game, and the Sheep Beast in the final act is great for set-piece related nonsense. But there are other encounters and enemies that are so understated you'd all but forget they even exist in the game if not for memorable visual design. The examples worth noting for me are the Pelican, which is on screen for all but 5 seconds it feels like and never shows up again for some reason, and the Brook Horse, which just kind of exists for a particular underwater sequence. These 2 creatures are notable because they have memorable design and seem like they should be bigger or more persistent threats than they are, but ultimately are only really utilized for a singular chase sequence apiece, and then they're kind of just gone. I can appreciate wanting to leave a sense of wonder or horror in the player by not overutilizing these things, as said before, but I can't deny that I was a bit whelmed by a couple of these creatures in the way they were used. In fact, I actually wondered for a bit if the pelican and brook horse were actually the same thing, but extremely modified on account of some off-screen goings-on, you know, the way that the sheep beast does throughout the final act. All this to say that I think these two complaints of mine, while fairly minor, make me wish the base game of Reanimal was an hour or two longer than it is, adding just a bit more substance to the portions which feature these particular enemies so as to make them more of a presence, this being the main wish that I have. One of the most memorable things about Tarsiers' past work in Little Nightmares is how entire sections of those games, the chapters of them, are so easily and effectively recalled because of the predominant setting and or monster involved. Somewhat as a result of this, I also do think that the chapter delineation in Reanimal is slightly off-kilter, you know, not super aggressively so, not anything worth making a big deal over, but some of the chapter splits being more obvious while others are nigh impossible to determine makes for a somewhat strange experience when playing in the context of those chapters. For example, in my first run of the game, I would have guessed that it was 6 chapters long, because I guessed I was completing chapter 6 with what turned out to be the final one out of 9 actual chapters. And as a side note, I actually thought that chapters 7 through 9 altogether were one single chapter because of how they were constructed. Is this kind of thing really that big of a deal? No, not really, but it did mean I experienced a bit of confusion at just where some of the chapter splits end up being, and maybe part of this is also influenced by Little Nightmares 3 chapters for the most part being quite lengthy, especially compared to this. I don't know. That's just a guess. But to be fair, to this game, I also think that this particular nitpick could be turned into a praise all its own. Namely, the consistency of much of the world-building decisions and the way that everything really flows together, even when big shifts occur, make for a total one-sitting style experience that is very satisfying in Reanimal, where some other games perhaps are not, even at similar lengths. I believe that my quote-unquote complaining about the subtle strangeness of chapter splits basically comes down to my experience with Little Nightmares. In hindsight, that comparison is perhaps a good bit unfair. But back on the topic of Little Nightmares as well, I actually find it hilarious that Reanimal arguably has a slight issue with homogeneity across certain multi-chapter sequences, because Little Nightmares 3 had actually the exact opposite problems. Its zones were so separate and disconnected both in physical connection and in design that it actually felt like there wasn't really anything tying most of it together, whereas Reanimal is cohesively one world even when things do get a little bit strange. So in the grand scheme of things, I actually love that Reanimal feels so broadly cohesive. Until the last few chapters where things suddenly turn into World War I for some reason that I'm still trying to figure out, and before the ending brings the story full circle, I think, question mark, I'm not entirely sure. I haven't figured that part out yet, but generally speaking, there is a pretty cohesive design here. And also, as just one final note, Reanimal somehow does even less with its co-op potential than Little Nightmares 3 did as a final complaint, and the lack of interesting gameplay mechanics for that setting was one of the disappointing aspects of Little Nightmares 3 when I reviewed it. It's a bit unfortunate for this to do even less on that front, and I do think it is forgivable in both cases, but considering that the games are completely doable for one player, I think it's generally fine. As a solo gamer, this is alright by me, but it is a little disappointing. But speaking on co-op, I think it's time we finally start to shift some gears to a more positive train of thought as a whole. I bet I probably sounded pretty nitpicky there during that section, and I was, but nitpicks are not broad-scale failings. Very little of what I actually talked about over the last several minutes significantly alter my opinion of the game. Like, they just don't. It takes what could have been a 5-star perfect game for me down to perhaps a 4.5 instead, but to say that I loved Reanimal in either case would be the better framing. So time to reflect that. But a brief section on the co-op, like I said, there is one very obvious thing that Tarsier has over supermassive games. In this case, regardless of your taste of the games, Reanimal actually has local co-op and not just online co-op. I know, what a concept. I still cannot believe that Little Nightmares 3 doesn't have local co-op, by the way. Like, that is an utterly insane decision. And more insane that I actually even forgot to include it in my original Little Nightmares 3 brief review script. So, funny that. And another thing as well on the co-op front, Reanimal also has cross-platform play as well, meaning you should not have to be on the same device for online co-op to work. Yet again, another insanely baffling decision on Supermassive's part, because that game, Little Nightmares 3, does not have local co-op or cross-platform play. Are you kidding? Like, what are we doing here, Supermassive? But in short, if you're looking for a short horror experience to play with a friend or something, if you're looking for a game to play in co-op, Reanimal is your friend in any scenario, whereas Little Nightmares 3 inexplicably forces you to play on its terms. Yet, the co-op experience is not the only thing to praise. In fact, it is the praiseworthy piece of this package that I think I have the least occasion to mention, considering that I personally played it all solo, though I might be playing it again soon with a friend whom I also played Little Nightmares 3 with to let him experience and to get more bang for my buck, so I'm probably going to do the same here. But anyway, what about the rest of the game? The major thing is that Tarsier leans into its strengths, something I believe I've commented about a time or two already. The intro cinematic, which is very Little Nightmares coded, the waking up in a mysterious place completely in over your head that you slowly explore over time, the slow buildup of tension within the world leading up to actual scary moments, the foreshadowing with regard to creatures and exploration, having to, as a player, just kind of figure out what you're doing to a degree. All of that energy from Little Nightmares is here in Reanimal. On that last point, Reanimal is a little bit more keen on providing the player prompts than Little Nightmares is, just so you know, but I think that this is partially on account of it having more than like 3 controls that you have to actually track, As far as that opening chapter tonal foundation in general though, both in gameplay and in the meta player dynamic, Reanimal clicks all the right buttons for what I expected from this studio. But the thing that makes this familiarity work isn't just the fan service that it could be argued to be. What makes everything click together is actually how it builds off of that familiarity. One such example is by abandoning the dollhouse-esque type of framing, side view that Little Nightmares has going on, and instead going for a more proper 3D world aesthetic. Instead of waking up and immediately heading to the right and basically exclusively going right throughout the entire course of the game, Reanimal instead has you traverse deeper into it upon the start. The way this immediately lets the player recognize that Tarsier isn't resting on their laurels, but instead is expanding the scope of that style that they forged early on. It does so effectively, implicitly. Another thing Reanimal does immediately different is that it has a bit of dialogue. You see it, or, well, hear it, I guess, when you grab a friend out of the water shortly ahead of the beginning of the game. There's not much of this throughout the game, for better or worse. It could be considered somewhat nebulous or enigmatic, ill-conceived, and not entirely serving a clear purpose, but I actually am inclined to see the vision behind the decisions made here. You can tell there's a lot going on under the covers with Reanimal when it comes to themes and story, which is itself also taking a page out of the Little Nightmares playbook. And so the yet quite limited dialogue and the vagueness of it ironically tends to serve the mystery in its own way. It makes clear that there is some history between the characters, both player characters as well as those you come to meet, without trying to explicitly lay out a story that you can just understand just by playing the game. Reanimal relies on non-verbal material for its story just as much as Tarsiers' past work does. And on the note of story, I again don't fully know what to make of this so far. I love the way you start to wrap a picture together while you play, kind of like the Little Nightmares games, connecting things back to the opening cinematic. I also enjoy the task of rescuing our friends here and there a lot, and the tense player scenarios that this task allows for both directly and indirectly are really satisfying. I also am really into how weirdly existential and thematically intense the game gets in its final act, even if a lot of that seems kind of out of place at first. And while the ending, or rather everything to do with the sheep beast in particular, is also pretty what the fuck in nature, I find myself more intrigued than put off where Reanimal is concerned. Even the secret ending doesn't actually give you a ton to work off of in the best way possible. You have a lot of hints and clues about certain things, but not a lot of it makes explicit sense, and normally this would be a bad thing, but here I do think it actually works. Finally, I also like how Reanimal approaches the idea of narrative circularity in its storytelling, a bit more creatively than, say, like Little Nightmares 2 utilized, because the ending of Little Nightmares 2 felt like it was doing that sort of circular narrative device in a somewhat forced manner, although it is cool that both games make that circularity a key piece of their replayability. Though I don't personally need to play Reanimal anymore, as I have already completed it, I am compelled to do so anyway, both in the co-op setting that I hinted at before, and also solo as well, just because I can, for the purposes of studying the world and creatures of Reanimal, and also exploring every inch of it as best as I can to try to piece together what I can of the story. This is something that the original Little Nightmares was actually somewhat uniquely able to get out of me, going so far as to compel me to write an entire theory about what Little Nightmares 2 might end up being. While I'm not sure that I'm going to theorize about something like the Reanimal DLC, for example, I can say that the game has hooks in my brain unlike most other games. If I am disappointed in Reanimal, it is disappointment that there isn't even more game right now, or even more challenge in its trophy list. And there I've touched on a few other great points. First, I'll mention again that completion requirements for Reanimal are incredibly approachable. It is possible to beat the game in one playthrough if you were lucky enough or used a guide, but I actually encourage trying to achieve as much as you can without using any guide. I highly wish I didn't actually end up using one on my second run of the game. While it is satisfying to get so many trophies so quickly with regard to collectibles and stuff, even most of the miscellaneous trophies in this game are decently possible to obtain just kind of as a result of playing, or just accidentally by messing around a bit, just doing things in the world, unlike Little Nightmares 2, for example, where I would say that half of the miscellaneous trophies of that game I never would have gotten without a trophy guide. Regardless, completion in Reanimal is super easy, whether you use a guide or not, and there thankfully are also not co-op related trophies for it, although if there were, at least one could do so locally, or even by themselves, without having to rope in a friend to actually get them, unlike Little Nightmares 3. The main things that paragraph about story brought up, however, besides the trophy list, that I really want to sing the praises of, are mostly about the world and the creatures. Let's start with world building and exploration of Reanimal. The long story short is that it is pretty top notch. We are all quite familiar with what Little Nightmares was doing from a puzzle platforming perspective, and to an extent I'd argue that part of what made Little Nightmares 3 so disappointing was its lack of evolution with this formula. Supermassive played the game so safe it ended up just being a bit boring to a lot of people. Reanimal, on the other hand, completely shakes things up. Remember when I mentioned that more proper 3D approach? Well, this is the reason that I'm talking about. There are times when the floatiness and acceleration-like tendencies of the camera when trying to, move it manually, particularly in the boat sections, get quite bothersome, or certainly at least cumbersome, but as a general rule, there's more inherent dynamic to the manner of exploring in the world in ways that I think totally suit this kind of game, actually. This is an instance of Reanimal seeking to carve its own path based upon what came before, respecting that thing, but expanding upon it with the new IP in a way that I think totally works. It also allows for certain kinds of set pieces and sequences that weren't possible in Little Nightmares games to exist. Sequences like running up the clock tower in Act 2, exploring with the boat in between chapter chains at the end of the first couple of acts, driving a freaking tank for pretty much literally the entirety of Chapter 9, if I'm not mistaken, on the chapter cutoff there, and chase sequences in particular are worthy of note in this game, as they are a whole new kind of exciting that I largely really enjoyed. The tank section can be a bit janky though. The quieter moments in between the set pieces also see the effect of the adjustment to world building and broader design philosophy. The puzzles are certainly of the same broader category as you will surely be used to already, but the way it just fits seamlessly into the world is certainly to be commended. Similarly, I want to shout out just how much more intuitive the combination of exploration and puzzles felt in Reanimal for me personally. Not only do subtle prompts exist in most places if you ever have any question about whether you can or cannot interact with something upon approaching it, but the game also just felt a lot less obtuse. I didn't have to look anything up except for the secret bunker trophy, if I'm not mistaken. Not realizing that the solution was something I'd actually overlooked in a much earlier previous area of the game, rather than missing it somehow where I was looking for it. Simply overlooking that one secret was really the only time that I was lost for more than a couple minutes in the game, and the times that I did get lost were also when I similarly overlooked the obvious clues of where I needed to head, like needing to move a particular dumpster out of the way or something. I was never lost for long, and even that's not something I can fully say for Little Nightmares. Little Nightmares 2, especially with that weird elevator puzzle that for some reason I really struggled with. In totality, Tarsier was able to greatly expand what they could do with Reanimal entire as a result of adding to the perspective. The Little Nightmares thing is great, and it serves a great purpose there, but I'm really glad to have seen the world grow a lot in Reanimal, even if parts of it feel slightly underdeveloped or underutilized, as was the case with some of the bigger monsters. And to return to the topic of monsters, oh boy, these things are cool. I think the Sniffer is immediately going to be familiar to Little Nightmares fans, although there's some, occasionally weird things going on with his AI. Like, one time I think he detected me from across a particular courtyard, despite it being impossible for him to have seen or heard me. He just happened to know I was there for reasons that I've not been able to ascertain. But he is the appetizer for enemy design here, with just the right manner of weird going on to hint at some of the other weird shit to come. That said, major monster design does jump a lot from the Sniffer. The Pelican is interesting, but again, doesn't exist long enough to make much of an impression. The Mother is awesome and allows for most of the game's most interesting moments. The Brook Horse is thoroughly freaky and unsettling, though also used less than I would have optimally liked. The Sheep Beast is a great centralizing figure to the third act, especially as it changes. And actually, I'm just now realizing while doing this section of the review, the roles that these creatures actually seem to fill. Sniffer is the main antagonist of Act 1, Mother is the main antagonist of Act 2, the Sheep is the main antagonist of Act 3. The Pelican and Brook Horse are kind of bridges in between those sections of the game, so I guess it makes sense that they feel underserved in the game relative to the others, even though they are by far the most visually interesting to me. But anyway, the major monster design is great, and similar to world design, also evolves that which has become familiar from Tarsier's previous games. It actually takes us to our next topic of discussion, the way the game tackles horror. More specifically, body horror. You see, Little Nightmares is not unfamiliar to the edges of body horror. All of those monsters and general atmospheric tendencies lend to a subtle degree of body horror that creeps out, yet also ironically kind of delights. There's something enticing about the mystery of why those people are the way they are, and basically never are any of the designs taken to a place that would cause the average person a legitimate degree of discomfort. Reanimal takes things a step further by dialing back the creepy a bit more in favor of disturbing. Don't get me wrong, it's still got the Tarsier creep factor to it, especially in the first act of the game, but once you're past the sniffer, most of the creatures get gradually crazier and crazier in a notably more explicit manner than Little Nightmares ever did. That's not necessarily to say that the game is super gory or inherent nightmare fuel per se, not for adults anyway, but where Little Nightmares makes for a wonderful introduction to horror for those unfamiliar, and also for those a little bit younger, such as preteens, Reanimal definitely ups the ante a little bit. As an understatement. Reanimal is more likely to actually freak out a preteen in my estimation, for example, even if much of what it's doing thematically and tonally appear to be similar for the most part. But you know, kind of a similar thing could also be said for general enemy design as well. You know, there are smaller enemies in the first act that pursue you, there are birds that will attack you, children to face off against, and World War I soldiers to avoid, all very different kinds of enemies, to Tarsier's credit. They've not entirely foregone basic enemies in past games. You know, think of the Shadow Kids in Little Nightmares 1's DLC, and the school children in Little Nightmares 2, but the manner of empowerment and defense that Reanimal provides is also a smidge expanded in ways that I think work out, actually, rather than trying to maybe escape the maw or investigate the transmission tower. We're saving our friends in this game, and allowing us to more effectively fight against the kids, for example, is great, and stuff like that is made more effective by the Act 1 skin snake slitherer things being an enemy that you have to avoid. Also, the sheer jump in maturity that the World War I soldiers provide also kind of completely offsets the way that these encounters are thought of in Reanimal to me. You know, returning to the point on the type of horror, I mentioned Reanimal as being a little bit more existential as a result of a lot of this stuff. You know, hell, even the way the sheep beast comes about and the thematic bedding of its existence in the world is something that I think is inherently more mature than what Little Nightmares tries to explore to any degree, although it is still presented in an innocent enough way that many might not catch on entirely to what Tarsier might be saying with it. But I think it's worth noting that the World War I soldiers in this game predominantly exist to self-delete right in front of your character, which in and of itself is, I believe, a little bit too much for the kind of audience that Little Nightmares is most perfectly targeting, so be aware of that if you're a parent. This isn't a bad thing, by the way. I choose to make this point clear in case anybody looked at the M rating and wondered if Reanimal was really that much different than its predecessors, and I'd argue that yes, it is. It is seeking to be a more explicitly graphic and disturbing body horror experience where Little Nightmares merely hinted at that kind of stuff. The difference isn't that great to the average adult, I don't think, but certainly that stuff combined with the more existential real-world imagery of this game, which itself separates the game from the world of Little Nightmares, will make the difference in appropriateness for other audiences, you know, a bit more of a question mark, just kind of inherently. Your mileage may vary, but those are my general thoughts on that topic. But insofar as Reanimal does seek to be more mature, that also makes it a similar kind of expansion as so many other parts of the game to me. It's like the game is aging up a bit, being the next step on a new horror fan's journey post Little Nightmares, rather than seeking to do the same thing, or worse, arguably diluting it like Little Nightmares 3 did. Reanimal approaches horror in a way that evolves that formula just as much as everything else, and I think that it does so well because it doesn't forget its roots. I have spoken long enough about this game. I'm surprised that it's coming anywhere near approaching a half hour in length, assuming it's not over that long. I honestly thought that I'd have a 12 or 15 minute video out of this at maximum, potentially even sub 10 minutes, but that is not the case with this script's word count. You're welcome, or I apologize, whichever you prefer. In the end, I just want to close by saying I cannot wait for the game's DLC to arrive late this year, or for it to start arriving late this year. Probably its first DLC drops somewhere in the same time frame as Little Nightmares 3's second DLC does. I'll be sure to review both games' DLC packages in full once they are complete in their own right, much like I reviewed each base game, so look forward to that kind of content probably in about a year from now. But in conclusion, I think that Little Nightmares fans will be delighted by what they find in Reanimal if you choose to check it out. While I would not blame you for waiting for a discount on it, this is a case where I think it's worth it if you're a big enough fan of the games, like me. You know, unlike Little Nightmares 3, where I think it should be waited on for a pretty steep discount for basically anybody wanting to try it. Reanimal might be more worth it if you wait for that time to give it a try, but I do not think that this game was disappointing even for what I paid. I told the truth when I said I can't wait to see what the DLC chapters have to offer. Besides, if you already know somebody who owns this game, I'm pretty certain that there's also a friend pass option for online co-op here, just like there was for Little Nightmares 3, and it's absolutely worth experiencing for technically free that way if that is how you experience it. But hey, I appreciate everybody who checked out this review in whatever format, whether on YouTube or on Backlogged or wherever else. But for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you all again with the next one.